Was Alexander the Great gay? TLDR, maybe. Some sources say he was, but rarely explicitly, and there's reason to doubt them.
Thanks, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Thanks to my Patreon supporters on Patreon.
The goal of today's video is not to address the question of Alexander's sexuality. Instead, we'll be exploring what we know about the life of a sort of side character in Alexander's history, Bagoas. Bagoas was a eunuch in the court of the Persian king Darius III, who may or may not have been a transgender figure. A while back, when we explored the story of Hypsicrates, we talked about how his life is intricately connected with that of his lover Mithridates. As a result, it's not really possible to discuss the two of them apart from each other. This is also true with Bagoas. So this video is about Alexander the Great, but only as a consequence of the historical narrative. Look, this is just one example of what real historians mean when they talk about how true objectivity is not really possible when it comes to telling history. Alexander had possibly hundreds of thousands of people meet him and accompany him throughout his conquests, each of whom had long, rich, complex inner lives, as much as anyone. We don't know the names of the vast majority of them. In that regard, Bagoas is lucky. But in Bagoas's case, we only know about their life in relation to Alexander. The fact that the information itself was passed to us is a result of bias in the historical record. The life of Bagoas and of the hundreds of thousands of others were deemed of lesser importance than Alexander's. So you're dealing with deeply biased information in the first place and doing your best to interpret it in a way that helps you better understand the period. There's no objectivity in the texts, there's only subjective viewpoints from subjective people. We do our best to put together an accurate outline of what happened, but there's only so much we can know. So, to understand Bagoas, we need to understand Alexander. But to understand Alexander, you have to understand his father Philip. And in order to understand Philip, you have to understand the history of classical Greece. And I know most of you aren't classicists, so that's where we're going to start. Oh boy. Our goals today will be twofold. First, we'll find out whether Bagoas was real, and if they were real, we'll find out whether or not they were trans. Let's take a look. Chapter 1, Summing Up Classical Greece as Quickly as I Can. So what we call classical Greece is a span of about 200 years, the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. That's the 400s and 300s BCE, which has always been confusing to me, but we won't get into that again. Anyway, the classical era of Greece is marked by a whole bunch of individual sovereign states who occasionally united to do important stuff, like kick Persians down a well or wrestle each other in the nude. But for the most part, they spent their time bickering and fighting with each other. Let's grab that cool old map of Greece that I showed you last time. This didn't work. Didn't really work last time. Hopefully it works this time. There we go. Can you see it? Hell yeah. These were the polis, or city-states of ancient Greece. Athens and Sparta are the most well-known ones, but there were a bunch of other ones as well. Thebes, Corinth, Argos, Megara, Thessaly, Arcadia, Messenia, the list goes on. These states all had a shared Greek identity, but they also looked down on each other for various reasons, and fought each other over dumb garbage. Oh, suffering mortals, why do you get yourselves spears and shed each other's blood? No more. Rest from toil, and keep watch over your cities, sitting quietly with your quiet fellow citizens. The sum of our life is but short. We should pass through it as easily and with as little toil as we can. And yet wars kept happening. Go figure. Democracy. You gotta love it. Now, I'm aware of how wordy I can be sometimes, and there's a lot of history to cover here, so I'm going to challenge myself here. We're going to sum up each of these eras leading up to Alexander in a single minute each. Let's start with the First Persian War. The Persian Empire was a massive expansionist power that stretched from modern-day Turkey to around the border of India and into North Africa. Huge, they liked to conquer. They took their Greek colonies in Asia Minor, Thrace, and Macedonia, and the rest of Greece was next on the list. They sent an envoy to Greece asking for their surrender, and the Greeks just murdered the envoy, so they went to war. Persian king of kings Darius I brought 90,000 troops with him, and their strategy was to fire a whole lot of arrows from long range. This worked most of the time, but not against a Greek phalanx. The phalanx formation was individual Greek soldiers called hoplites, standing shoulder to shoulder, with a shield in their left hand, and in their right they'd hold a long spear. There were several rows of them, so there were multiple rows of guys sticking their spears out. This made it really difficult for individual soldiers to penetrate. The guys in front would use their shields to protect the front, and the guys in the second row and back would protect from arrows coming from above. That stopped the Persian assault. The Greeks put aside their differences for once to fight against the Persians and came to blows at the Battle of Marathon in 490. The Persians did the arrow thing, but that didn't do much against the Greek phalanx. 6,400 Persians died in this battle and only 192 Greeks. The Persians quickly realized this wasn't going to work, so they retreated. That's the end of Persian War I. Awesome. I can't believe I did that. In 480 BCE, the Persians returned to Greece under Darius' successor Xerxes, coming through the hot gates, Thermopylae. This is where the "this is Sparta" guy died, but there were more than just 300 Spartans there. Herodotus gives us specific numbers for about 5,200 guys, and an unspecified numbers of other guys showed up as well to help them. There was actually a guy named Leonidas in charge, though he wasn't originally played by Gerard Butler. They held the pass at Thermopylae for 3 days against the massive Persian army, but when things started looking grim, Leonidas ordered most of them to withdraw. The 300 Spartans remained, along with 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans. No, stop. But I guess 1400 isn't as good a name for a movie, and it doesn't sound as tough. Spartans sounds manly and badass, but Thespians sounds like a bunch of wimpy theater kids. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet led by Athens held off the Persian fleet at the Battle of Artemision, which ended in a stalemate. That bought them time, but the Persians pushed through. The Athenian admiral Themistocles drew the Persian ships into a trap at Salamis, forcing their retreat. He's just as much a hero in the story as Leonidas, but he doesn't get the credit he deserves. #justice for Themistocles. Maybe it's because he didn't die in the battle, but that makes him better in my opinion. Skill issue. If he was non-binary, it would be Themistocles. I know it is. I'm so sorry. The Persians pushed pretty far, though, and actually sacked Athens itself, but they couldn't make it past Corinth, where the allied Greeks had built a wall to stop them. Eventually, the Greeks fielded an enormous hoplite army and finished off the Persians at Plataea. That ended the Persians' attempts to conquer Greece, but it also left the Greeks with a whole lot of animosity toward the Persians that would last for a very long time, and will play an important role in our story. From there, the next biggest conflict in Greece was by the Peloponnesian War between the Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. Here we go. Sparta had the strongest land army in Greece and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, Athens had a powerful fleet of warships called triremes. Now remember, there's no gunpowder yet, so instead these ships had big bronze rams on the front of them. They bash into the other ships and sink them, or shear off fjords and board them, then fight hand to hand. After years of skirmishes, formal hostilities began in 431 BCE. The Athenians knew they didn't have a chance against the Spartans in a pitched battle, so when Sparta invaded Attica, everyone who lived in the outlying villages just hid in Athens behind the walls. The Spartans torched the farms but couldn't get through the walls, so the Athenians could use their navy to bring food and other supplies in and to launch coastal raids against Sparta. It's a shark versus a lion. Both were powerful, but neither had a decisive advantage, so the war dragged on for decades. Cities were besieged, allies were rebelled and were crushed, lots of people died, there was a plague in Athens, lots more people died, somebody broke all the dicks off the statues, and everyone had a miserable time. Eventually, the Persians offered to finance the construction of a Spartan fleet to challenge the Athenians in exchange for recognition of Persian sovereignty over Asia Minor, which at the time had a bunch of Greek colonies in it. The Spartans agreed and built a massive fleet of 200 triremes. This allowed them to win a decisive naval victory near the Hellespont, where modern Istanbul is. This forced Athens to surrender, damn it, and Sparta became the clear dominant power in Greece. Almost. Whatever. Anyway, that's that. Sparta wasn't top dog for long, though. Most polis had armies made up of regular citizens who had to supply their own equipment. Meanwhile, the Spartans were professional soldiers who drilled their entire lives for warfare and relied on another Greek polis they'd enslaved, Messenia, for everything not related to combat. But the hoplite formation depends on how strong you are all as a unit. So naturally, professional soldiers will fight better than like a baker and a farmer and a bunch of other guys who didn't really want to be there and whose equipment might have been old and crappy. There's a big reason why the Spartans were so much better than anyone else at hoplite warfare as a result. Anyway, after the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE, Sparta was dragged into a bunch of different conflicts that weakened its position, and eventually they came head-to-head with Thebes. The Thebans were led by the brilliant general Epaminondas, who'd fought alongside the Spartans in the past. His observations of their strategies gave him the knowledge he needed to counter the Spartans, delivering a crushing blow at Leuctra in 371. This deflated Spartan hegemony and led to Thebes being the top dog for a while. One of the tactical innovations Epaminondas came up with is the Sacred Band of Thebes, And if you know what they are, you know why I'm not speedrunning this part. The theory was that stronger bonds between soldiers would cause them to fight harder, to protect each other. And what stronger bond is there than that between two lovers? So, the Sacred Band of Thebes was made up of 150 pairs of male lovers. This is not generally considered a controversial statement by modern scholarship, by the way. They were literally a group of 300 gay male warriors. In his Life of Pelopidas, which is down there it is, Plutarch goes pretty in depth into why he thought gay lovers would be better warriors than anyone else. They would fight harder to protect each other, they wouldn't want to look like a coward to each other, and hey, it worked for Heracles and Aeolus. So the Sacred Band of Thebes, along with the rest of the Theban military, gave the Spartans their first major defeat on land of the classical era. This was earth-shattering stuff and led to the era of Theban hegemony over Greece. So all those big, strong alpha male bros who want to train like Spartan warriors, their heroes were defeated by a bunch of gay men. Awesome. During this era, there was a hostage living in Thebes named Philip, and he's a very important character in our story here. Here we go again. Philip was a member of the royal family of Macedon, which had recently been subjugated by Thebes. As he lived in Thebes, he paid close attention to Epaminondas's tactics and developed his own strategies to counter them. It worked. Once he returned to Macedonia, he became a military leader, then shortly after became king when his brother Perdiccas was killed. His hoplites had much longer spears, which you'd hold with two hands, and a shield mounted on their left arm. That meant they could be deadly far earlier than the Greeks. Philip wanted to lead the various Greek states, but not to subjugate them, so whenever possible, he preferred to win over the Greek states with diplomacy, not military victories. After many years of battles and political jockeying, he established the League of Corinth in 337, which was a general peace between all the Greek states, except Sparta, which stubbornly refused to join. Philip was the hegemon of the League. The League having been assembled, Philip began planning an expedition to the east with the goal of conquering Persian territory. Then, at his daughter's wedding, he was assassinated. His young son, Alexander, would succeed him. Awesome. And that's where we pick up the thread of this story. In earnest. Ad break. If you've watched this far, thank you for doing so. It's hard to make it these days, so this is the part of the video where I let you know about the ways I'm finding to survive capitalism. I know it's annoying to have every YouTuber do this, but until we all get off our collective duffs and overthrow capitalism, this is the best we have to work with. If it makes you feel any better, I'm equally annoyed by having to put this in the video in the first place. First off, I'm a voice feminization coach. If you've watched my videos before, you may notice that primary sources are read in a much more masculine voice. But that's still my voice. I worked hard to feminize my own voice, and I can help you as well. Hit me up. My email is in the description. The first session is free, and after that, I offer a pretty broad sliding scale. Next, my books. YouTube has been a great way to share transgender history so far, but who knows how much longer it'll be around for. That's why I've begun turning video content into zines. Putting this work into physical form and getting it in the hands of as many people as possible will help these stories continue to survive, no matter what happens in the coming years. The first one is based on the video on the Enarees. You can get an ebook copy or a physical copy. Half the proceeds from sales of these will go to Rainbow Railroad, an organization that helps LGBTQ2IA+ people who live under oppressive regimes to relocate to Canada. Finally, you can buy a copy of my novel, The Bottom Line, through our link in the description. It's a science fiction novel which has nothing to do with this channel's subject matter, but whatever. It's a story about identity and how to navigate life when your identity is taken away from you through the lens of automation in the near future Toronto. I have some first edition versions left, so if you buy one of these, I'll sign it for you and I'll mail it to you. You can also support the channel on Patreon or becoming a member. It starts at just $1 a month, and if you like the idea of helping others learn about transgender history, it makes a huge difference. Also, like, comment, subscribe, you know how it is. Just do it, all right? Seriously, just do it, all right? What are you waiting for? Now, without further ado. Chapter 2, Alexander the Great. So it's 336 BCE. The king of Macedonia is dead. Long live the king! After some power struggles and assassinations, the 20-year-old Alexander III inherits his father's crown, becoming ruler of Macedonia. His hope was to rule the rest of Greece as well, like his father did, as head of the Corinthian League. The rest of Greece, meanwhile, was never really keen on Macedonian rule in the first place, and planned to use the death of Philip as an opportunity for independence. Alexander reasserted control over the Corinthian League, but Athens stubbornly refused to rejoin, Sparta was never part of it in the first place, and Thebes kicked out their Macedonian garrison as soon as Alexander left. Alexander learned about this. He's furious. He returned to Thebes with an army so quickly that the Thebans didn't have a chance to rally any support. Then he burned it to the ground, destroying every single building in the city, except the temples, the Cadme citadel, and the home where the poet Pindar lived. This worked. The rest of Greece, including Athens, pledged their loyalty to the Corinthian League. Sparta still refused to join. Fast forward to 334 BCE. Alexander has consolidated his power and assembled his military, and now begins his true ambition, to invade and conquer Persia, just like his father wanted to, on the context of liberating the Greek and other cities Persia had conquered. But what does every legendary hero need on their journey? A trusty steed and a loyal companion, of course. Alexander had both. At age 12, he met his black horse Bucephalus, the man-eater. This was a savage, wild horse who wouldn't allow anyone to break him. Alexander saw this as a challenge and broke him. Plutarch tells us after he did so, Philip said to him, quote, "My son, seek thee out a kingdom equal to thyself. Macedonia has not room for thee." And I mean, this is something that you'd put into a biography if you wanted to foreshadow what comes next, and not necessarily because you cared a lot about accuracy, but yeah, it's a funny little anecdote. And as for the faithful companion, what better option is there than your childhood bestie? In this case, it's Hephaestion. Quintus Curtius tells us a bit about him, quote, "He was by far the dearest to the king of all his friends, brought up with him, and the confidant of all his secrets. He also had more freedom than anyone else in admonishing the king, a privilege which he nevertheless used in such a manner that it seemed rather to be allowed by the king than claimed by himself. And though Hephaestion was of the same age as the king, he nevertheless excelled him in bodily stature." They were very close. Very close. Very, very fond of each other. Very. Oh yes. The two grew up together and were educated together by Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. And yes, they quite possibly were lovers as well, which is also pretty fun. Big, strong warriors who loved each other. They're so manly that they're man-on-man manly. Aside from being one of his closest advisors, Hephaestion was also commander of Alexander's elite cavalry, the hetairoi, or companions. Now, if you watched the video on Lucian's Dialogues of the Courtesans, you may remember the Greek word for prostitute sounds a whole lot like that, but this word is hetairai, not hetairoi, clearly linked etymologically, but not quite the same thing. Or maybe they chose their heavy cavalry units because of how handsome they were. Who knows? Anyway, Alexander, Hephaestion, and like 40,000 other guys arrived at the ruins of Troy, where they met up with Parmenion, a Macedonian general they'd sent beforehand. Here, they stopped to honor Achilles and Patroclus by taking part in some Homeric funeral games. As a young boy, Alexander loved reading the Iliad, and his mother supposedly claimed ancestry from Achilles, which is probably not true because Achilles was almost certainly not a real guy, but hey, whatever. I guess you can just claim descent from any historical candidate you want. My favorites are 2008 presidential candidate Barack Obama and 2025 prime ministerial candidate Mark Carney. Anyway, stopping at the ruins of Troy was a pretty standard thing to do when you invaded Asia. Agesilaus, king of Sparta, had invaded Asia 60 years earlier and did the same thing. But at the same time, the homoerotic undertones of the story of Achilles and Patroclus have been well studied in ancient times as well as today. Homer himself never portrays them as anything more than just close and loyal friends, but Plato talks about the pairs as lovers in the Symposium, probably because he and his pals always had such things on the mind. Since both Alexander and Hephaestion were tutored by Plato's student Aristotle, they were, I'm sure, familiar with all the interpretations of the story. This is actually the first time that Hephaestion is mentioned in many of the histories, and rather unceremoniously as well. We're not really sure why, but one interpretation for this is that the relationship between the two was well known at this point, so there was no need to introduce them specifically as lovers. As Jona Lendering put it, we don't have to introduce Juliet once Romeo was on the stage. From there, they moved on to the Granicus, where they fought the first real battle against the Persians. I'm not going to get into the details of the military tactics here, but it was a major victory for Alexander's forces. The Persians retreated, and from there Alexander moved through Persian territory largely unopposed, taking control of the Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor, then went south along the Levant. When they reached Sidon, Quintus Curtius tells us Alexander let Hephaestion choose who would rule the city for him. After that, there's one battle-related story I want to talk about just because I think it's neato. As Alexander conquered Persian territory, some of the cities welcomed him since they weren't fond of Persian rule. Others surrendered through negotiations, but eventually he reached Tyre, a Phoenician city which is still there today with the same name in modern-day Lebanon. There were, in fact, two different Tyres. Old Tyre was on the coast, and New Tyre was an island just off the coast. Once Alexander arrived at Tyre, he met with the city's elders in Old Tyre and demanded that he be allowed to make a sacrifice at the temple of Melkarth, whom he identified with Heracles. But the elders didn't want him on New Tyre, so they said he could use the perfectly good temple of Heracles in Old Tyre. This enraged Alexander, so he destroyed Old Tyre. But because New Tyre was an island half a mile out from the shore, they felt they could hold out for a long time. Alexander recognized this and understood how difficult it would be to besiege the island. He had a strong navy courtesy of 3 kings of Cyprus who defected, and some catapults and siege towers, and he could try to use those, but Tyre had a powerful navy, and he'd have to deal with them before he could get on land and get over the walls. So he sent an envoy, promising to leave them in peace if they surrendered. The Tyrians responded by murdering the envoy and throwing the bodies over the walls of the city. Not cool. So he had his soldiers bring dirt, logs, and rubble from Old Tyre to the coast with the idea of building a land bridge out to New Tyre. The Tyrians didn't make this very easy, firing arrows at the Macedonian engineers, but over the span of a few months they were able to get to Tyre and bring it under heel. Why is this interesting, you ask? Because Alexander's land bridge is still there today. It is silted up over the years, and now Tyre is no longer an island, but a peninsula. It's not always that somebody we know about in ancient history changes the geography of an era in a way that we can still see today, but Alexander is one of them. After, Alexander set Hephaestion in charge of his fleet, while he continued on land, conquering all the way to Egypt, which surrendered without a fight, and proclaimed him pharaoh. Alexander founded the city of Alexandria, the first of many, at the mouth of the Nile. It was already a place called Rakotis, but whatever, now it's Alexandria. I bet he changed its pronouns too. Ugh. Even Alexander is woke now. Its biological name is Rakotis, and its biological pronouns are bird guy, feather, feather, boat. While in Egypt, Alexander learned that the Sumerians in modern-day occupied Palestine were revolting. Maybe they hadn't bathed in a while. So he returned to the area, cleaned things up, and moved on. This took them into unfamiliar territory. Up to that point, they dealt with Mediterranean climate and geography, but this took them away from there, bringing a sense of unease to the campaign for the first time. He didn't know it then, but this was the last time Alexander would ever lay eyes on the Mediterranean Sea. Alexander and his army, made up of 40,000 hoplites, 7,000 companion cavalry, and around 2,000 supply carts, traveled across the Euphrates River and headed north, in search of the Persian army. They finally met at Gaugamela in modern-day northern Iraq. Darius had the advantage. He'd chosen the battlefield, assembled his troops, cleared the field for his charioteers, and laid traps to prevent Alexander's cavalry from encircling them like he'd done previously at the Granicus. Because they kicked up so much sand and dust into the air, the chroniclers couldn't really see what happened, so the details of this battle are largely unknown to us. But the important point is that Alexander was victorious, but Darius escaped once again. Even still, the great Persian army was a small fraction of what it once was, and was no longer a threat to Alexander. This was the last real chance Darius had had to stop Alexander's army from running roughshod across his empire, and he had failed. Alexander was now free to stroll through Persia at his leisure. They headed to Babylon, where Alexander declared that he would spare the city and its inhabitants. So they surrendered, and Alexander entered the ancient city without any bloodshed, just like they had in Egypt. He was recognized as ruler and appointed a Persian Mazaeus as satrap, sort of like a governor. He was the same guy who'd surrendered the city in the first place, which was a smart move on Alexander's part. After all, other satraps would be more willing to surrender if they know they'd get their same rollback with no damage to their power, to their wealth, or to their city. A few weeks later, the Macedonians received reinforcements and moved on. There were 4 major capitals of Persia for them to capture: Susa, Persepolis, Pasargadae, and Ecbatana. First up was Susa, which also surrendered without a fight. A little anticlimactic if you ask me, but overall I suppose it's a good thing to not have a bunch of people murdered for no good reason. From there, they pushed deeper into Persian territory, and it was around this point that they had to finally give up the pretense of being liberators of those conquered by the Persians. They were themselves the conquerors now, plain and simple, and would face the appropriate resistance. The Persians fought hard, but regardless, the Macedonians managed to defeat them and take Persepolis and Pasargadae at around the same time. Alexander stayed at Persepolis for 4 months, during which time he let his soldiers loot the place. When they left, they torched Xerxes' palace at Persepolis as a sort of revenge for Xerxes' sacking of Athens. Of course, Xerxes was long dead at this point, but I'm sure his ghost would have been really upset. Meanwhile, Darius was at Ecbatana, the final capital of Persia yet to be captured, hoping to receive reinforcements and to disrupt the Macedonian supply lines. Learning that Alexander's forces were on their way, Darius took the city's treasury and fled just a couple of days before they arrived. At this point, Darius must have realized he couldn't raise an army as large as the one he fielded at Gaugamela, and even if he could, he already knew that that wasn't enough to defeat the Macedonian forces. With Alexander in hot pursuit, Darius fled from Ecbatana. His goal was to reach Bactria, which was unfamiliar terrain to the Macedonians, favorable to his own forces, and controlled by a relative of his. They reached Ragai, modern-day Tehran in Iran, but couldn't stop. The treasures they brought with them slowed them down, and the Macedonians weren't far behind. As they fled, Darius's forces were becoming increasingly unhinged. The constant threat of attack from the Macedonians had them on edge. Many of them must have had their homes already captured by the Macedonians and may not have even known what became of their families. It was becoming increasingly clear that Darius was not going to win this war, and Alexander had shown himself to be merciful to those who surrendered. So why stick with Darius? Why indeed. Darius's forces gradually peeled away as he got further and further away from the heartland of Persia. Eventually, this demoralization reached even the highest ranks of his forces. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria and a relative of Darius, must have realized that if he stayed loyal to the king, he'd face the Macedonian forces in battle and probably lose. He'd seen Alexander's ferocity firsthand as one of Darius's generals at Gaugamela, but if he surrendered, he'd probably face the same clemency his fellow satraps did. He might even stay in power. So he led a coup and captured the great king. He sent messengers to Alexander telling him what had happened. Alexander took 60 of his best riders, probably including Hephaestion, and raced to overtake the traitors. After 2 days of intense riding, resting only in the high noon heat, he found a train of supply carts, with one left abandoned on the side of the road. In it, they found Darius III, Artashata, Kodomanus, inheritor of the great line of Achaemenes, king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire. Dead. He was murdered by Bessus. This isn't the last time he'll appear in our story. Alexander treated the body of his foe with honor, wrapping it with his own cloak and sending it to Persepolis for a royal burial. This secured Alexander's ambition as the ruler of the Persian Empire, but he had still to secure the rest of it, to bring peace, freedom, justice, and security to his new empire. He granted clemency to the nobles he found with the supply carts, then returned to his army and reached the satrapy of Hyrcania along the Caspian Sea, where Darius had his palace. Darius's remaining forces had fled there, since there was plenty of forest in which for them to hide. There he met Nabarzines, a cavalry commander in Darius's army, and one of the conspirators who'd murdered Darius. He negotiated clemency for himself in exchange for surrender and some other gifts. One of those gifts was Bagoas. Chapter 3. Alexander and Bagoas. From what we can tell, Bagoas was a fairly common name for eunuchs in the East. Ovid has a character named Bagoas in his Amoris, whom he specifically refers to as a third gender. Quote,
"Bad luck that your mistress should have a keeper who's neither male nor female."
Was Ovid referring to our Bagoas? I don't think so. Ovid's Bagoas is the guardian of a woman Ovid is trying to woo, because writing sad boy love poetry was Ovid's favorite thing to do. Maybe Ovid's Bagoas is a reference to our Bagoas, but other than the name and the eunuch status, the two don't seem to have much in common. Now, there are 2 historical Bagoases we know of. Both of them were eunuchs, and both were in the court of the Persian King of Kings. One of them had assassinated Darius's predecessor years earlier, but was assassinated himself in turn. Our Bagoas is different. Our Bagoas seems to have been bilingual, understanding both Greek and Persian. This would have been really useful for Alexander, who likely only knew a bit of Persian himself. We don't know much about Bagoas' life before they linked up with Alexander. We're told they were in the court of Darius III, with whom they had a sexual relationship. At some point, they were with Nabarzines, who of course gave them to Alexander. Other than that, though, we don't know much about Bagoas' life before meeting Alexander. However, the elder Bagoas was a high-ranking official in the Persian court, so it's not necessarily the case that Persian eunuchs were slaves. Our Bagoas might have been from an upper-class Persian family, since they seem to have ended up in Darius' inner circle, but that's about all we know. What did Hephaestion think of Bagoas? We don't know. In fact, we don't know a lot about Hephaestion in general, compared to some of Alexander's other companions. Quintus Curtius did tell us earlier that Hephaestion was able to criticize Alexander because of their close relationship, but if he did have any feelings about Bagoas, they haven't been passed down to us. But here's something interesting. Alexander had twice refused gifts of beautiful slave boys, so Bagoas must have been really something special. Perhaps something different than a slave boy? Let's get back to our story and see if we can find out. In Hyrcania, Alexander also received the surrender of a contingent of Greek troops who'd fought for Darius. If they joined the Persian military before Alexander's campaign, they were set free, but if they joined after, they were conscripted into the Macedonian force at their usual pay rate after being given a stern talking to. Bagoas would have known about these soldiers before when he was Darius' companion, so he may have helped Alexander make the decision not to punish them. Also, Alexander's horse Bucephalus was captured in this region. He was quickly returned, though, after Alexander showed up at the village in full force and threatened to murder everyone. Great guy. At this point, Alexander is in control of a big chunk of Persian territory, and all the Greek cities under Persian rule had been liberated. But the Persians could still be a threat at some point in the future. After all, the Greeks had beaten them back twice already, and they were still around, causing trouble and meddling in Greek affairs. As well, Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who'd murdered Darius III, we talked about him a moment ago, styled himself Artaxerxes V and claimed to be king of kings himself. I guess he'd forgotten about surrendering to Alexander. He could rebuild from there and retake the Persian heartland, so Alexander pushed forward. Now, this put him in a difficult position. First of all, his troops were becoming increasingly ornery and disillusioned. To them, the mission was accomplished, and many of them longed to go home. But at the same time, they all had a long-standing and well-earned distrust and even hatred of the Persians. They would have all heard stories about the destruction and the suffering their ancestors had dealt with during the invasions of Darius II and of Xerxes. But Alexander had been reinforcing his army with his new Persian subjects along the way, so the more he appealed to them, the angrier his Greek soldiers would become. But if he snubbed the Persians, they would become far more difficult to rule, and fewer satraps would want to surrender. This put him in a constant back-and-forth position, where appeasing his Greek army would upset the Persians, so he'd have to mollify the Persians, which would upset the Greeks, and so on. No doubt Bagoas and other Persian advisors were helpful here, acting sort of like spin doctors, maybe, to the uppity Persians Alexander had unwillingly upset. Fake news. Yes, you. Yes, Aphrodisianus here from the Pasargadae Press. What does the king say about the reports Persepolis was looted and burned by his own soldiers? How are we to trust a king who says he will offer clemency to anyone who surrenders, and then turn around and burns one of our great capital cities to the ground? How do you answer this? You really believe the ridiculous conspiracy theory that Persepolis was looted? That's preposterous. This is all part of a smear campaign to ruin our great king's good name. This is fake news. Yes, you over there.
Yes, Scoop McGillicuddy, Alpha Beta Gamma News here. What are we to make of reports that the king is going native, that he's becoming more like the Persians, the very people he came here to defeat?
How can you say such a thing? Our great King Alexander is just as Greek today as the day he was born. After all, he let his Greek forces loot Persepolis. What more could he offer you people? Will you never be satisfied? This is more fake news. They continued on, reaching Arachosia, and refounded the capital as Alexandria, which still exists today. It's the city of Kandahar in Afghanistan. From there, they pushed into the Hindu Kush mountains, hoping to reach Bactria and defeat the pretender Bessus. This involved a lot of different marches across deserts, glaciers, and rivers. It was around this time that they would have reached the capital of Bactria, called Bactra. if you watch the video where we explored the grave goods of a trans feminine Enaree priestess. It was near here. It's one of my favorite topics that I've covered so far, and it's going to provide you with some more context for this region. The grave wouldn't have been there yet, though, not for another 250 years or so at least. Eventually, they caught up with Bessus, where his own courtiers betrayed him and eventually executed him in a particularly gruesome way that I really don't want to get into. At this point, Alexander was the undisputed king of kings, and any threat of major Persian resistance was finished. From here, it was random tribes and Persian revolts. They were in the Great Steppe, and if you watched the main video on the Enarees, you may remember how flat the terrain is out there. That makes it ideal for fighting on horseback, but not for the phalanx style the Greek army was used to. It was there, in 329 BCE, that Alexander finally realized he couldn't continue in this direction. So they secured the borders, where he found Alexandria Escat, the furthest Alexandria, which is modern-day Khujand in Tajikistan. Then they headed south to India. Some battles were fought, some atrocities were committed, and Alexander's beloved horse Bucephalus died, incredibly of old age. Obviously, this is a massive oversimplification, but this isn't actually a video about Alexander, believe it or not. Eventually, in 326 BCE, they reached the Hephasis River. Today, it's the Bias River in northwestern India. When Alexander ordered his troops to cross it, they refused. After a few days of moping, Alexander realized that his army wouldn't change their mind, so he decided to begin the long journey home to Macedonia. They headed south toward the Arabian Sea with the idea of traveling through the Gedrosian desert until they reached Persepolis again, then to Babylon. Along the way, they had to fight through the Malian territory in modern-day central Pakistan. During this fighting, Alexander was nearly killed by an arrow that pierced his lung. He survived, but would be in constant pain for the rest of his life and contribute to his heavy alcoholism. They marched through the desert, which claimed many lives along the way. Plutarch tells us he lost more than 3/4 of his men to the desert. Eventually, though, they reached the royal palace of Gedrosia, where the local satrap cared for the king and the beleaguered remnants of his army. Hephaestion, meanwhile, followed after Alexander through the desert with his forces. This must have been an even more difficult journey, since Alexander's group would have grabbed whatever meager resources they were able to find along the way. But at least they had the trail of desiccated corpses to guide their way. But eventually, he made it too. Alexander gave his army time to rest and recuperate, but he must have been feeling the exhaustion as well. Morale must have been unbelievably bad at this point, so Alexander held a festival, which was full of the usual drinking and debauchery customary of his court at this point. In particular, Plutarch tells us about a contest. Quote,
We are told, too, that he was once viewing some contests in singing and dancing, being well heated with wine, and that his favorite, Bagoas, won the prize for song and dance, and then, in all their festal array, passed through the theater and took their seat by Alexander's side, at sight of which the Macedonians clapped their hands and loudly bade the king kiss the victor, until at last he threw his arms about them and kissed them tenderly.
Oh my. The 2nd to 3rd century CE Greek writer Athenaeus confirms this. Quote,
Alexander the king was also very much in the habit of giving into this fashion. Accordingly, Dicaearchus, in his treatise on the sacrifice at Troy, says that he was so much under the influence of Bagoas the eunuch that he embraced them in the sight of the whole theater, and that when the whole theater shouted in approval of the action, he repeated it.
The treatise by Dicaearchus doesn't survive outside of this one tidbit, unfortunately. Based on the title, it seems to have been about the sacrifice Alexander and Hephaestion made at Troy, which is too bad because it might have been a good source for us. Oh well. Once they had their energy back, Alexander and his army left Gedrosia, eventually reaching Pasargadae, which was the capital of Persia under Cyrus the Great, some 2 centuries earlier. Since then, it had served as the empire's religious center. There they met the satrap Orxines, whom Quintus Curtius tells us was actually a commander at the Battle of Gaugamela as well. He bestowed lavish gifts upon Alexander and his friends. However, he specifically left out Bagoas, who took great offense to this. Quintus Curtius tells us about this story. Let's take a closer look. Quote,
When he had honored all the friends of the king with gifts beyond their highest hopes, to Bagoas, a eunuch who had won the regard of Alexander through prostitution, he paid no honor, and on being admonished by some that Bagoas was dear to Alexander, replied that he was honoring the friends of the king, not his harlots, and that it was not the custom of the Persians to mate with males who made females of themselves by prostitution.
Indeed. Orxines badmouths Bagoas, so Bagoas turns around and does the same. Bagoas went with Alexander to the tomb of Cyrus the Great and opened it up to pay it honors. He didn't find much in there, which Alexander found surprising. Then Bagoas basically accuses Orxines of grave robbing. Quote, "What wonder if the tombs of the kings are empty, when the houses of their satraps cannot contain the gold that they have amassed before them? For my part, I had never seen the tomb before, but I learned from Darius that 3,000 talents of gold were buried with Cyrus. Hence that generosity to you, in order that what Orxines could not keep with safety, he might even curry favor by giving away." Alexander got big mad about this, so he had Orxines executed. Rough, but I mean, protect the dolls, right? From there, they moved on to Susa, where they quelled a revolt, then to Ecbatana, where they were entertained by its satrap. During one of their customary nights of heavy drinking, Alexander's closest friend and probable lover, Hephaestion, fell ill, and a few days later, he died. Alexander was devastated, of course. One imagines Bagoas comforting Alexander during this time, but even still, the great king was becoming increasingly isolated. Next, they headed to Babylon, where he began to receive embassies. We're told that representatives came from all over the ancient world. From there, he planned a new war against the Arabs, which would have referred to parts of the Arabian Peninsula. After that, he planned to conquer Carthage, the Greek states on Sicily, the fledgling Roman Republic, and the rest of the Mediterranean. Alexander had a funeral for Hephaestion, where he was honored as a demigod. After, he became ill himself and rapidly declined. Bagoas must have tended to him during this time, but despite all the riches, territory, and doctors in the world, it wasn't enough. On June 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died, not in battle, but of an illness. What of Bagoas's fate? We don't know. They're never mentioned again after the bit with Orxines. Our Alexander chroniclers generally point out when someone in Alexander's inner circle dies, so one imagines that they would have mentioned it if Bagoas had died. But they were in a pretty good position overall. After all, the fact that they were so beloved by Alexander tells us they must have received a lot of special treatment. And court eunuchs weren't generally warriors, so Bagoas wouldn't have died in battle or anything. Quintus Curtius tells us Bagoas was, quote, in the very flower of boyhood when they first met Alexander, which would have been fairly young. This could have been a result of their having been eunuched at a young age, and as a result, not having gone through puberty, that Bagoas really was that young, or both. But either way, Bagoas would have likely been in their late 20s at the oldest when Alexander died. So one imagines Bagoas outliving their legendary lover by a great many years. Perhaps they found a place in the court of one of Alexander's successor generals. But beyond that, we don't know what their final fate would have been. Chapter 4. Problems with this story. Now, there's a bit of a problem when it comes to the story I just told you. We don't know how accurate it is. See, we know there were a lot of contemporaries who wrote about Alexander. More than 20 of them are known to us, in fact, but none of them have survived. So what we know about his life comes from later writers. They reference these earlier works, which is why we know they existed, but we don't have any manuscripts. They don't even directly quote them. This is the thing about biographies of ancient figures. They're notoriously difficult to assemble with any consistency because of the sources we have. We face that issue when we explore the story of Elagabalus. The different sources say different things, and each of them has reason to be doubted. But that's true with a lot of emperors, since their lives are so wrapped up in propaganda, either for or against. On top of that, an incredible amount of ink has been spilled on the life of Alexander over the years. Back in my undergrad, I did an essay on Alexander, and my professor told me if I started reading about him then and didn't stop to eat or sleep, I still wouldn't be able to read everything written before I died of old age. I don't know if he was exaggerating or not, but I believe it. Speaking of which, rest in peace, Dr. Murison. You are a real one. Anyway, we'll try to keep this as simple as we can. For the life of Alexander, we have 6 main sources: Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, Quintus Curtius, Justin, and the classic song Alexander the Great from Iron Maiden's 1986 album Somewhere in Time. Diodorus Siculus is the closest to Alexander time-wise, but he wrote during the 1st century BCE, and Alexander died in 323 BCE. That's like a 300-year gap, so it's a particularly problematic biography to build. In terms of Bagoas, of the group we just talked about, it's only Quintus Curtius and Plutarch who mention him, so let's talk about them. First, Quintus Curtius. Not much about him is known. He does refer to the Parthian Empire as existing while he wrote, so that does narrow it down to like a 500-year period between 247 BCE and 224 CE. Super helpful, awesome stuff, we love it. He refers in Book 10 to a Roman emperor who stopped a civil war, so we know at least he wrote during the imperial period, which is from 27 BCE onward, but there are a bunch of emperors who put down civil wars, so that doesn't really narrow it down either. We're pretty sure the text is a Latin original at least, and not a translation from Greek. It's 10 books long. Now this is a weird text. Some chunks of it are missing, including all of books 1 and 2, and there are some other gaps along the way as well, but that's not the part that's weird. Unfortunately, that's pretty common with ancient texts. No, what's weird about it is that nobody else references it in the ancient world. Usually we get ancient writers referencing each other. That's how we know that a lot of sources existed, even if we don't have them today. But we have no surviving references to this text from anywhere else. That's weird. Why not? Some historians assume it was because he was widely disliked, and so his work was shut out of the world of letters at the time, but I don't like assuming things were conspiracies because, I don't know, that leads to lazy thinking, in my opinion. Also been suggested that his work was closer to a historical fiction or even a parody of history, but there's no real solid evidence of that either, and in fact he spends part of Book 8 talking about his historiographical methods, so that doesn't make sense either. In the end, we don't know when he wrote, why none of his companions referenced him, or anything about him or his life. Super cool. Plutarch, on the other hand, we know quite a bit about. I gave him a pretty detailed biography in the video on Hypsicrates, so go check that out if you'd like to know more about him in detail. But he was born circa 45 CE in Chaeronea, central Greece. He studied at Athens and became a consul under the Emperor Trajan. He's best known for his parallel lives, where he writes a biography of a Greek and a Roman and lines them up with each other. It's a noteworthy and important collection that gives us a lot of what we know about the ancient Mediterranean. His life of Alexander is paired with that of Julius Caesar, which I'm sure would satisfy Caesar's enormous ego. Some of his other pairings, including the generals Pyrrhus and Marius, Demosthenes and Cicero, and J.K. Rowling in this barrel of toxic waste here. So these two sources, the only Alexander chroniclers who mention Bagoas even indirectly, wrote hundreds of years after his life. But of course lots of other ancient sources talk about Alexander as well, but they're not about Alexander, if that makes sense. So we do actually have another source that mentions Bagoas as well, Athenaeus, a Greek writer from Egypt in the 2nd to 3rd century, which we briefly talked about earlier. He tells basically the same story Plutarch does, but with some subtle differences. He does so in a work called the Deipnosophistae, which means essentially philosophers at the dinner table. It's an important work for all the literary references it makes, but not so much for the Bagoas story, so I'm just mentioning it in passing here. So 3 sources on Bagoas, all of which wrote long after their life. This has led some scholars to question whether or not Bagoas ever existed. So let's explore those arguments. Did Bagoas Was Real? The scholar W.W. Tarn, who wrote one of the most influential and in-depth works on Alexander the Great, writes off Bagoas as a fictional character. In fact, when analyzing Quintus Curtius's work, he calls Bagoas, quote, his masterpiece of cynicism. Why? He clearly doesn't think very highly of Quintus Curtius. In fact, he spends several pages talking about his lack of historical principle. Okay, see ya. It's almost like a diss track, but like 2,000 years after the fact. Scholarship is like this sometimes, and sometimes even living researchers attack each other. You'd think someone with a PhD and years of experience in academia would be able to make their arguments without calling each other names like they're on the playground, but hey, nobody's nerfect. Anyway, Tarn provides a few reasons why he doesn't believe in Bagoas. We might call him a Bagoatheist. You shouldn't, though. That was stupid. He gives a few main reasons why he doesn't believe the Quintus Curtius story. We'll have to parse through each of them on their own, though, because this is a pretty complex topic. So we have 3 clear incidents of Alexander and Bagoas interacting. Nabarzanes surrendering Bagoas to Alexander, Bagoas winning the dancing contest and kissing Alexander, and Bagoas encouraging Alexander to execute Orxines after his disrespect. Tarn addresses each one and says why he doesn't believe them, and scholar Ebadian does a great job of addressing why these reasons are kinda silly. The next section will rely heavily on Tarn's scholarship, as well as the work of Ebadian, who addresses these arguments and dismantles them. This next section will rely heavily on Tarn's scholarship, as well as the work of Ebadian, who addresses these arguments and dismantles them. I'm giving credit here, see? Please don't Summerton me. Point your plagiarism Death Star somewhere else, H-Bomb. Oh crap, I mentioned a Star Wars thing. Now Disney's gonna come after me. Guess I'm cancelled. Well, there's always a new career as a right-wing influencer. The woke mob canceled me because I dared to tell the truth. This video is sponsored by Definitely Not Dog Food.
Yum yum. Use the coupon code FREEDOM for 14% off your order.
It's fucking gross, dude. No, look, I do my best to present new and interesting ideas in these videos. That's what I did in the last video, the one on the transgender Venus from Cyprus. But to go that in-depth into a topic took me more than 3 years, and I don't think I'm quite at the point where I can be that inconsistent and still have people care about what I do. I'm not H-Bomber guy. So here we are. If you want more original scholarship, I'd love to give it to you, but I need a whole lot of you to chip in some dough to make that happen. Patreon
In the description, like, comment, subscribe, yada, yada, yada.
First off, Quintus Curtius tells us Alexander hummed and hawed about whether to pardon Nabarzanes, and that was unlike him. Tarn claims he was much more decisive than that. Alexander never put any decisions off, to which I absolutely cannot relate. But is this true? Not really, no. I mean, sometimes he was decisive, yeah. We can all make quick decisions sometimes. Okay, most of us can. But he definitely took the time to deliberate on certain decisions and even changed his mind sometimes. The shock, the horror. Alexander wasn't just an impulsive young idiot after all. We saw this at the Hephaestus River, when his troops refused to go any further. Rather than deciding to go home right away, they stayed for a few days. The 2nd century CE Roman Greek writer Arrian of Nicomedia tells us more about this. Quote,
He retired into his tent and did not admit any of the companions on that day, or until the 3rd day from that, waiting to see if any change would occur in the minds of the Macedonians and Grecian allies, as is wont to happen as a general rule among a crowd of soldiers, rendering them more disposed to obey. But on the contrary, when there was a profound silence throughout the camp, and the soldiers were evidently annoyed at his wrath, without being at all changed by it, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, said that he nonetheless offered sacrifice there for the passage of the river, but the victims were unfavorable to him when he sacrificed. Then indeed he collected the oldest of the companions, and especially those who were friendly to him, and as all things indicated the advisability of returning, he made known to the army that he had resolved to march back home.
This quote shows that while Alexander did have a strong and stubborn will, he kind of needed it to get as far as he did, he could also be convinced to change his mind given the right circumstances. Whether that's by means of his troops flat out refusing to go any further, or through the wiles of his soon-to-be lover, he could have his mind changed. So this argument is kind of silly, and I think we can just dismiss it outright. Tarn's next argument is that Quintus Curtius contradicts himself by saying Nabarzanes offered Bagoas to Alexander in exchange for a pardon when the king had already pardoned him. And sure, Quintus Curtius isn't the most precise historian, but imagine contradicting yourself within 2 sentences. What is he, a politician? Instead, he suggests that Tarn's conclusion is based on a misunderstanding of the text. Nabarzanes asked for Alexander's fides, basically his guarantee of safety. In return, he receives inviolatum, or inviolability. But this isn't quite the same thing as forgiveness. So what this meant was that Nabarzanes could safely approach Alexander without fear, but it wasn't until Bagoas did their thing that Nabarzanes received a full pardon. This is a little silly too, right? Like, even if we do admit that Quintus Curtius is careless at times, can we really expect someone to be that daft? Ancient people were no more or less intelligent than we are today. We just have fancier toys. Then again. But within 2 sentences? Well. Anyway, these days, anyone with half a dozen working brain cells and backing from far-right billionaire investors can crank out 100 ghost-written books. But in the ancient world, it was a little different. You still often needed a wealthy patron, but paper was much harder to come by back then, and so was literacy. Scholar William Harris estimates in his book Ancient Literacy that during the early Roman Empire, likely less than 10% of people were literate. I tend to think it might have been a bit higher than that, especially considering how much graffiti there was all over the place. But regardless, your odds of being literate enough to write a book were pretty low if you were just some guy. That means even if we don't know anything about Quintus Curtius personally, we can still piece together at least a bit about his life based on what we know about literary circles in ancient Rome in general. In particular, we know he must have had access to an education, which, as we said, was nowhere near as much of a given as it is these days. So we assume he would have been clever enough to recognize if he was contradicting himself within 2 sentences. Anyway, this one isn't quite as silly as the first one, but I think we can also call this one debunked. The final reason Tarn gives for why he believes the Nabarzines story is fiction is because Alexander never executed any of the conspirators against Darius III. After all, they took care of his rival for rule of Persia, so Alexander didn't mind. So Bagoas's entreaties to Alexander wouldn't have been necessary, and as a result it must have been fiction. But there are 2 key arguments against this point. First of all, there are examples of when Alexander punished the conspirators against Darius. Bessus, for example, who organized the whole thing, was sent to Bactria to be executed. Both Arrian and Diodorus Siculus tell us that. And yes, he was pretending to be the king of kings, so maybe there's that, but Alexander also executed Barzantes, another conspirator against Darius, according to Arrian. So what does Tarn make of these events? He simply rejects their validity. This seems really silly, especially since the source our historians give for Bessus's execution is actually the Macedonian general Ptolemy, who was the one who actually captured Bessus and would have had no reason to lie about it. But here's the thing, Bessus and Barzantes were both executed after Alexander met Nabarzines, so it's kind of a moot point. So Nabarzines wouldn't have known how Alexander would treat him. On one hand, he took care of Alexander's rival, but Alexander clearly wanted to capture Darius alive. Nabarzines was smart to be cautious here. So we don't yet have a great reason to disbelieve Bagoas' existence. Badian destroys Tarn with facts and logic. Must see. Orxines was in real alive? Tarn tells a tale of 2 Orxineses. One is the man Quintus Curtius tells us about, and the other is Arrian's Orxines. We do get 2 different stories here, so it's worth taking a look. Arrian's Orxines usurped the satrapy of Persis, where Persepolis and Pasargadae were, while Alexander was in India. When Alexander returned, Orxines was accused of looting and murder and was hanged as a result. So to answer the question in the last title, yes, Orxines was in real alive. There's not much doubt there, but clearly these stories contradict each other. They can't both be true, can they? Tarn uses this as evidence that Quintus Curtius' story must be wrong, but that's starting from a conclusion and finding the premises to back it up. It's not necessarily the case that Quintus Curtius is wrong or right until we have evidence to support one conclusion or the other. Why is Tarn so hard on Quintus Curtius? Because Tarn views his work as overly moralizing, and he's not wrong there. He comes across as almost squeamish while he describes a striptease Alexander and his companions watched while in Babylon, and this absolutely colors his description of Orxines and Bagoas. Let's take a closer look at that quote again. When Orxines snubbed Bagoas, he said,
He was honoring the friends of the king, not his harlots, and that it was not the custom of the Persians to mate with males who made females of themselves by prostitution.
What did he mean by made females of themselves? It meant Bagoas was an ancient trans woman. No, not necessarily. It's tempting to jump to that conclusion, but we're not conservatives here. We're going on more than just vibes. We look at the evidence and come to a conclusion. We don't get to just make stuff up, and that's why right-wing propaganda is so easy to make. Could you imagine if it were as easy for us as it is for them? I could just show up on here and say Julius Caesar was transgender, just because, and people would believe it because of that one time Gaius Scribonius Curio called him, quote, every man's wife and every woman's husband. No, we live in reality, and that means we have to spend time finding out the truth. So what did Orxines mean? This is an interesting point to consider, since while Orxines was of course a Persian, Quintus Curtius, who wrote this, was a Roman, and his portrayal of Orxines would have been colored by his own beliefs about gender and sexuality. So when we examine this, we'll need to do so from both a Roman and a Persian perspective. Now, most of what we know about the Persians comes from Greeks and later Romans who wrote about them. There honestly just isn't enough information available for us to come to a nuanced understanding of Persian sexuality, period, let alone any existence and acceptance of what we might call today queerness, but we'll do our best here. We're getting mixed messages on this subject, though. Orxines attacks Bagoas, saying, quote, "It was not the custom of the Persians to mate with males who made females of themselves by prostitution." But then when Bagoas first arrives, we're told they were the favorite of Darius III. As well, we're told that Darius had 365 concubines and a whole bunch of eunuchs who served the same role. So what gives? It's well known that the Persians were very tolerant when it came to the religious and cultural practices of the peoples who lived in their empire. This made it easier for the Persians to exert control over them, since their populace was less likely to revolt if they could continue worshipping their gods and celebrating their festivals and practicing their cultural practices. So it's reasonable that different sexual practices might have been more tolerated in some areas of the empire than others. We also have other examples of Persian kings who, I don't really know what to call this, honestly. The literature refers to it as homosexual, but right now Bagoas is like Schrodinger's trans girl. So if we do come to the conclusion that she should be viewed through a trans feminine lens, that wouldn't really work. I guess I'll just say other Persian kings had a taste for eunuchs for now, and hope y'all will forgive me for the imperfection and imprecision in the language we have to work with. Anyway, Artaxerxes II also had a favorite eunuch, Tiridates, so there is precedent for this. It's not like Darius III was particularly unusual for a Persian king in this regard. So why would Orxines be so offended by Bagoas? The consensus seems to be that this bit was a literary invention by Quintus Curtius, projecting his own cultural biases, which is a great segue into Roman sexuality. Interestingly, there is no word for homosexual in Latin, but this isn't like a Mahmud Ahmadinejad situation.
In Iran, we don't have homosexuals.
The Romans had a lot of sex, like a lot. From the poorest of the poor to the emperors themselves, sex was all over the place. In fact, this was such a common practice that it was noteworthy for Suetonius to point out that the Emperor Claudius was, quote, libidis in feminas profusissimae marum omnino expers. He was the most interested in women, but had no interest in men. There's no sense pointing out something like that unless it's noteworthy, right? So the Romans definitely knew about homosex, and they probably had men who only fancied other men too. But the idea of applying one's sexual preferences to their identity, or of dividing their society among those who enjoyed same-sex relations and those who didn't, wasn't something the Romans thought to do. It's hard to draw a real proper analog here, but traditionally Roman sexuality has been described as active or passive, dominant and submissive, or masculine and feminine, but none of that really works very well. The closest we can get is top and bottom, or more precisely, penetrator and penetrated. I still don't really love that, but it'll do for our purposes today, and once again, I do apologize for the imprecision in the language we have to work with. If you were a Roman citizen man, you were free to have fun with as many men as you wanted without losing your social standing. In fact, it's been suggested that attraction to men as well as women was a normal, almost expected thing for Roman men. So in that regard, it may have been just as notable that Claudius seemed to only fancy women as it would have been if he'd only fancied men. The Emperor Hadrian, for example, was famously in love with a younger man named Antinous, with whom he spent a lot of his time. But he is also widely considered to be one of the greatest emperors Rome ever had. You may have heard of the 5 good emperors before, a period where Rome was ruled by 5 particularly competent guys in a row and who didn't have any major crises during their rule. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. So being a man who loved other men didn't stop you from being revered. Neato, but you could still lose social status if you played the receptive role. That was seen as more passive, submissive, feminine, not becoming of a proper Roman man, not displaying virtus, the Roman concept of masculinity. So if you were a proper Roman man who fancied other men, where could you find a man willing to receive? Well, you'd find someone lower in status than you, because in Roman society, not everyone had the same rights. Thing we live in a more enlightened time now, huh? Slaves, prostitutes, actors, dancers, gladiators, and other less savory parts of Roman society were lumped in under the term infamia. You might translate that as disgraceful, scandalous, dishonored, something along those lines. These people were already looked down upon by Roman society, and so could serve as the receptive partner without their social status getting any lower. So from a Roman perspective, Bagoas, being the submissive partner to Alexander, was something to look down upon. Bagoas also may have been a slave, and if that's the case, they would have been a lower status, and it wouldn't have been appropriate for Orxines to lavish gifts upon a slave. Again, from a Roman perspective. In fact, the very next section calls Orxines an imminent and guiltless man, and calls Bagoas that most shameless harlot. Not hiding his biases here. Orxines did nothing wrong, basically. So yeah, Quintus Curtius was absolutely moralizing in his works. But here's the thing, Arrian had moralizing tendencies too. He mentions stories of Alexander, the just, wise, and fair king, punishing the rebels who had done wrong while he was away, like a father punishing his mischievous sons. For example, Arrian tells us that Alexander removed Apollophanes, or Apollophanes, I don't know how to say it, but it sounds bad either way, Apollophanes as satrap of Gedrosia shortly after he arrived, because he wouldn't follow through on Alexander's orders. But later he tells us about the satrap of Gedrosia, who fell in battle while fighting off some rebels, named Apollophanes. What happened here? According to Badian, this is a misinterpretation of what actually happened. After the march through the Gedrosian desert, where, as we recall, a lot of people died, Alexander needed to blame somebody, so he blamed the recently deceased satrap. But the way Arrian presents it, Alexander showed up to depose a corrupt and disloyal satrap. This isn't the only example of such a thing, but it illustrates the point well enough. So just because Quintus Curtius is moralizing doesn't mean we should throw his account out, because, rules should be applied evenly, right? That's the whole point of a logical and just system. If we apply one set of rules to Quintus Curtius and another to Arrian, we're just showing favoritism, and it doesn't make any sense. So Quintus Curtius's moralizing tendencies are not evidence that he's entirely wrong. It does mean we should take what he says with a grain of salt, though. It also means that although the specific details of Orxines' execution might not have been accurate as Quintus Curtius tells it, the incident itself may still have happened in a broader sense. Did Bagoas was give and kiss to Alexander? So as we've seen, there's no ironclad reason to reject the Quintus Curtius has said about Bagoas. So there we are. But there's still the part of Bagoas' story that's told in Plutarch, the dance context that led to a Bagoas victory and a big ol' smooch from the king. Have we any reason to doubt that story? Let's see how Tarn dismisses this part. First, he says Plutarch sticks the event in the wrong place. And second, he says that it happens in a theater, and there wouldn't have been any theaters in the area. As a result, it must have been a fiction, because a Greek just couldn't have imagined a city without a theater in it. Okay? Really? Tarn says this bit damns the story completely, and Badian's reaction to this is actually pretty funny. He says, quote,
"To the unbiased reader, it seems almost incredible that such an argument could be seriously advanced as decisive."
Alright, so there might not have been a theater in Gedrosia, but they're putting together a performance for an audience of beleaguered, tired, and overwhelmed Greeks and Macedonians who just left a whole bunch of their comrades' corpses in the desert behind them. Is it really that much of a stretch to imagine that they might have set up a makeshift theater for the event? Or that they were set up in a different arrangement, but Plutarch just called it a theater because he was writing in Greek for a Greek audience, and it really doesn't make a difference whether it was in a theater or in a slightly different configuration, or if it was actually at the palace of Gedrosia in Pura, or if it was in another nearby city. Come on, this is so nitpicky here. Tarn clearly has a massive bias against accepting Bagoas' existence, and it's at this point that I'm realizing this is the reason why so much ink has been spilled doubting the existence of Bagoas. I really don't like to swear on this channel, but are you fucking kidding me? Why is this such a big deal? I don't like to jump to conclusions here, but it really does seem like the answer is good old-fashioned homophobia. According to Tarn, Dikiarchus, who, as we recall, was one of the original sources on the life of Alexander that's now lost, wanted to prove that Alexander was gay and had no real evidence, so he invented Bagoas. Yikes, dude. We don't know exactly when Dikiarchus wrote, but we know it was after the death of Alexander, which is self-evident, right? So what would Alexander's surviving veterans have thought of such an invention? What would Alexander's former generals and Hellenistic kings, Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, Antigonus, what would they have thought of such a fabrication? And what possible motive would he have had to want to invent such a thing in the first place? It's just silly. Look, all due respect to W.W. Tarn, whose research is important and foundational to the modern study of Alexander, but as we've seen, he gives us absolutely no real reason to doubt the story of Bagoas. It doesn't make any sense. But look, even if we run with the moralizing bit further here, it is true that the existence of Bagoas easily ties into a moralizing tradition of a king falling further and further into decadence. Scholars Michael B. Charles and Ava Babili point that out in their paper. Look up there somewhere for the citation. And it's true, the story of Bagoas does easily tie into a moralizing tradition, but it's intellectually lazy to just toss the existence of Bagoas aside just because it fits into a potential narrative. We saw that with the story of Elagabalus. Yes, it's true that Elagabalus's biographers were not at all kind to them, and we have reason to doubt the accuracy of each of them. However, the attacks levied against Elagabalus are so oddly specific that it seems also silly to just toss them aside, like nobody else was slandered in exactly the same way that Elagabalus was. So just because these chroniclers were moralizing doesn't mean the existence of Bagoas can easily be tossed aside like this. Does anyone else offer us something better? Pierre Bryant talks about Bagoas a bit in his book, Darius in the Shadow of Alexander, where he tries to get an understanding of Darius III as something other than a foil for Alexander as he's generally presented in the histories. But he specifically says, quote,
"Whether such an individual as Bagoas existed is not a problem that ought to occupy our attention."
That might be true for the purposes of your book, Bryant, but not for ours, so your work isn't going to help us much. Thanks anyway. Charles and Anagnostu, which I mentioned a moment ago, take a crack at it as well. We mentioned earlier that Bagoas was a common stock name for Persian eunuchs. Ovid had a Bagoas, as we mentioned, and so does Lucian in his satire The Eunuch, Quintilian in his Institutio Oratoria, and Heliodorus of Emesa in his Ethiopica. There was also the other Bagoas that we talked about, the one who put Darius III on the throne. Pliny even tells us that Bagoas was the Persian word for eunuch, though he's probably not right with this. So it's possible that Bagoas wasn't actually Bagoas' name, but rather the name of a kind of stock Persian eunuch character. Charles and Anagnostu also provide some linguistic evidence for this, which I won't get into detail here. People tell me my voice can be soothing, but I don't want to put you all to sleep. But that doesn't necessarily mean everything about Bagoas' story is false. The paper acknowledges that as well, saying that we'll never really know. And that might be the best way to conclude this long, drawn-out section. There are reasons, weak though they are, to doubt the story of Bagoas. If you're looking for evidence of that, you'll find it. There are reasons to believe the story of Bagoas. If you're looking for evidence of that, you'll find it as well. And for now, we'll have to be content with that. Personally, I lean more toward the side of Bagoas having existed, but short of another source on Alexander's life, we simply don't have enough evidence here. Chapter 6. Was Bagoas transgender? From here, we're going to assume Bagoas was real, because if they were not, this entire question is pointless, you know? It's very difficult to know whether Bagoas would have considered themselves to be a woman, or at least not a man. We don't have anything they wrote, and the quotes we have attributed to them don't have anything to do with gender one way or another. We also don't have any cases of Alexander referring to Bagoas as his, girlfriend or whatever, like we do with Hypsicrates, who was referred to using explicitly masculine language by his lover Mithridates. So the best we have is regional context. Was there a precedent for transgender individuals who came from the East? Yeah, there's tons of it. We've got the Enarees, the trans-feminine priestesses of the Scythian culture. We've covered them in depth in several previous videos, and we'll be covering them even more in future videos. We've got the Galli, the trans-feminine priestesses who originally came from Anatolia, but came to Rome and spread across the Mediterranean. The myth of Hermaphroditus, who was a god with both male and female aspects, is found on the Salmicus spring, which is also from Anatolia. Scholar Megan Cifarelli has been doing ongoing work on exploring the graves in Tepe Hassanlu, a site in modern-day Iran near the three-way border with Turkey and Iraq from roughly 2,800 years ago. There are a lot of graves here with a wealth of grave goods, and about 20% of the graves have grave goods described as associated with both males and females in their society. That doesn't mean these are explicitly transgender graves, but it does mean the people of Tepe Hassanlu either had a third gender in their society, or that the gender binary wasn't as rigid there as in other places. There's also the Gala, the Sumerian priestesses of the goddess Inanna, which I've not done much research on yet. I know a lot of you are waiting for that video from me. I'll get there one of these days, I promise, but they seem to display transgender themes as well. So there clearly was precedent for people who lived across the gender binary in the East. Gender is a conversation. It's the socially constructed roles people play in the world and how we adopt them into ourselves. It's how you perceive yourself, how you present yourself to the world, which any closeted trans person can tell you is not the same thing, and how the world perceives you in turn. So, how would Bagoas have been perceived by the world around them? Quintus Curtius says Alexander inherited a harem of concubines from Darius III. Diodorus Siculus and Justin confirm this as well. Diodorus Siculus tells us that each night they would parade around the king and he would choose the one he wanted to have fun with that night. However, he also says Alexander didn't do this very often, since he didn't want to offend his Macedonian troops. But Quintus Curtius tells us eunuchs were part of that harem as well. Quote,
365 concubines, the same number that Darius had, filled his palace, attended by herds of eunuchs, also accustomed to prostitute themselves.
The exact number is probably not true, but whether or not there were eunuchs in the harem is hard to confirm. If there were, though, they would have performed a woman's role in the harem, so that does suggest that Bagoas would have been treated like a woman and viewed and used similarly. There's also the insult Orxines throws at Bagoas. It was not the custom of the Persians to mate with males who made females of themselves by prostitution. Again, we know this is not true. It was the custom of many Persians to do so, but even still, this insult carries with it an accusation of effeminacy, of playing a woman's role. This tells us the more conservative elements of Roman society would have viewed Bagoas as, if not a woman, then at least something other than a man. But either way, based on the evidence we have, it doesn't seem possible to definitively declare Bagoas transgender either. I know that sucks, and I'm sorry to break the news to you. It's a real drag, and I wish we had a better explanation. That's the way history often goes, unfortunately, but the good news is we also don't have any reason to believe Bagoas was not transgender. So if you want to interpret them that way, you're free to do so. Like, it won't be weird, you know? And of course, that's what some people have done. It's probably not a big surprise to learn that Alexander's life was a topic of interest for people long after his death. That's true into the Roman age and well beyond. Geoffrey Chaucer, whom you might recognize as the author of the Canterbury Tales, referenced Alexander in several of his works, and so did a whole lot of other writers and translators, including Vasco da Lucena. Vasco da Lucena was born around 1435 in the city of Coimbra, Portugal. He moved to France at a young age with his older brother and studied at the University of Paris. Around 1468, he completed a work he'd been undertaking for about 3 years, the first translation into French of the works of Quintus Curtius. I grabbed a copy of it from my local library, and I mean, look how bloody big this thing is. Look at this. In comparison, here's my copy of Dialogues of the Courtesans. Like, this thing is enormous, but it's actually a really cool book. As Vasco da Lucena did his translations, he recognized that a big chunk of Quintus Curtius's work was missing. In particular, books 1 and 2 are entirely missing, and there are a bunch of gaps in other books as well. But Vasco da Lucena still wanted to tell a complete story, so he used some of the other sources we talked about with Alexander to fill in the gaps, all of them except the Iron Maiden record. What a poser. He wrote all of this into the introductions of his writing, but there's something about Book 5 and Book 9. Vasco da Lucena tells us he changed the name and gender of Alexander's lover Bagoas from male to female. Why? Scholar Zrinka Staholjak considers the time in which the translation took place, the era of humanism, of the Renaissance. Broadly speaking, this era marks the end of the medieval and beginning of the early modern eras of Europe. This era, like any other, had its own set of mores when it came to sexuality and gender, so maybe Vasco da Lucena was just a prude. But if that's the case, why not just not explain it? We've looked at cases of prudery in translations before, beginning all the way back in the very first extremely unpleasant video I did. Back before I knew anything about audio or video production, please don't go back and watch it, I will die of cringe. Instead, watch the video on Lucian's Dialogues of the Courtesans, where we also talked about prudery in translation, and I was much better at making videos at that point, and also include what I think is one of the funniest bits I've ever done, but it didn't get a lot of hits, so yeah, go check it out. Anyway, in that video, we discussed translations of the poet Martial's works. There are some pretty bawdry bits in his epigrams, and instead of publishing such filth, modern translators just leave it in the original Latin without comment. Vasco da Lucena could have done that. He could also have just made the change without mentioning it. Either of these options would have been preferable if he was a prude, but he didn't. He made the change and he called attention to it. Why? Staholjak argues that censorship of non-normative sexual behaviors is actually a far newer practice than Vasco da Lucena's work. In other words, Vasco da Lucena's goal might not have been censorship. Instead, it was a time of the emergence of more restricted gender and sexual norms, but they were still in the process of coalescing. So Vasco da Lucena's translation, Staholjak argues, ends up in the middle between fluidity and restriction. Interesting enough, but of course Vasco da Lucena wasn't anywhere near a primary source for the life of Alexander or Bagoas. He lives closer to us than he did to them. He still gave us some beautiful illuminated manuscripts though, including this one that shows Bagoas as a woman pleading to Alexander for the life of Nabarzanes. One of my favorite parts of this is that they didn't yet seem to have the idea that people in the past dressed differently than they would. So, it's supposed to be Alexander, but he's dressed like a medieval king. It's amazing. So the answer to the question of whether or not Bagoas was transgender is still that we don't know. But if you were to interpret them as such, you would be simply the latest in a long line of people doing so. Chapter 7. What does this tell us? So let me explain part of my research process here. When it comes to historical individuals with elements to their stories that seem, shall we say, something other than cisgender, I begin by piecing together a story of their lives as best I can. From there, I explore the question of whether or not they existed, if it's relevant. There's little question whether Elagabalus or Hypsicrates existed, for example, but it was a more useful question when exploring St. Pelagius. Then, I look to answer the question of whether or not they were transgender in a historical sense as outlined by Susan Stryker. When it came to Hypsicrates and Pelagius, the answer was a pretty clear yes. These were two historical individuals who were assigned female at birth, but who presented as men, took a man's name, and served a man's role in their respective societies. That's pretty clear-cut. Elagabalus, on the other hand, was a different story. There's reason to doubt the sources that tell us Elagabalus was transgender. It's reasonable to interpret these stories as simply historical slander, and to shrug our shoulders and say we really can't know about the life of Elagabalus beyond what we glean from archaeology. But at the same time, nobody in Roman history is slandered in quite the same way Elagabalus was. No other emperor, even the effeminate ones like Nero, or the mad ones like Caligula, is said to have scoured the empire for someone who could give them bottom surgery. So it also feels a little rash to simply write off the idea. In the end, we don't know. The same is true for Bagoas, and I know that's far from a satisfying conclusion. I don't really feel satisfying saying it, to be honest, but that's how this type of work goes sometimes. But while we couldn't prove Bagoas was transgender, we also couldn't prove they were not. That's something, at least. It leaves room for interpreting this story in a transgender lens. That's especially true for straight trans girls who could use a bit of support and representation, I'm sure. So, Bagoas goes in the maybe box. But the good news, too, is that Bagoas isn't the only example of transgender existence in the ancient Mediterranean upon which we can draw. From Pelagius and Hypsicrates, which we mentioned a moment ago, to the grave of the Enaree priestess we found in Bactria, to the many sculptures of Gala priestesses, we've barely scratched the surface today on what transgender individuals could look like in the ancient Mediterranean. Bagoas may or may not have been one of our trans sisters. We may never know. But I hope you'll still take heart in the possibility that they may have been, and in the many other stories of those who pretty definitively were. Because we have always existed. And so long as humanity continues to endure, so too shall we. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, I appreciate it. I hope you liked it. I'm not sure what happened to the audio quality at the end there, and I'm sorry about that, but hopefully it was still listenable. This is Cinder. You've met him before, of course, but this is him in his new apartment. His new cat tree. We keep saying we're so proud of him for moving out and getting his own place. They grow up so quickly. Anyway, let me know if you think the ad read thing was annoying or if it was, maybe the right call. And if you liked this, like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And you can support the channel on Patreon if you're really into this stuff, just like the people you see right here.